All right, we continue with our filming. And as I said, I had malaria, and that really forced me to leave the field and head back to Oxford. On the other hand, what I would say as an addition is that I have never left Roti, because I've done more field work, I've made short visits, I'm in contact with the Rotanese. I'll say more about that as these recordings go on. But in a sense, and I've also, and I think it's very important to say that I've continued to carry out my ritual obligations. And so I have performed very large rituals, mortuary rituals, mortuary remembrances, both for Old Menno and for Mias Kiuk. So it's a question of carrying out both your intellectual obligations, your social obligations, and your ritual obligations. All right. So we go back. This next section I would call a transition from Oxford through my various appointments to Harvard and then on to the ANU. So we cram a lot of different things in this, and I hope it's coherent. I went back to Oxford and I settled in very comfortably. My college gave me a very nice portion of a very large Oxford house, and I settled in. Well, initially we lived outside of Oxford, and to my wife's consternation, I bought an Irish wolfhound, and I was able to parade around the village with my Irish wolfhound, which made me almost English, because everyone would stop when dogs meet. You'd meet your neighbors only when your dogs meet. I lived in a little village called Islip. But then we moved into town after the birth of my first son. We moved into town and had a nice portion of a residence near the university and very near the Institute of Social Anthropology. I wrote my thesis, or I wrote the draft of my thesis. It was some 9, 10, 11 months of writing. And I gave it to Rodney Needham to read. And he took some time reading it. And usually he comes back very quickly with everything and with trenchant comments. And he came back with his comment, and he told me, this is, in his words, this is a torrent. A torrent. And as a torrent, he said, it can't be a thesis. So he excerpted the middle section from this flood of words. And he said, this is on social structure, his words again, and this is what your thesis will be. And so put an introduction and conclusion to this and submit it. I, always dutiful, I did what he told me. I submitted it. It was examined. I was very fortunate to have two distinguished examiners, Evans-Pritchard and Edmund Leach. We went through all of the Oxford rituals. I had my oral exam, and in that oral exam, I was hardly examined at all, because Evans-Pritchard attacked Leach about the way he did ethnography or didn't do ethnography. And for most of the time, I just listened to the two of them argue with each other. And that was my Oxford examination. So for better, for worse, that's the way they do it. And I got my degree. I then had a choice of possible positions. I was offered a position at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and I was offered a rather lowly position at Harvard. I turned both of those down and accepted a position at Duke University. I sent in a letter. There were still no emails. I sent in a letter telling them what courses I wanted to teach. And just as I was about to leave England to head for the United States, I received a telegram telling me that, quote, they were in a time bind. Not to be believed because it was already in the catalog. They were in a time bind and I was assigned 4 courses. The first of which was the introductory course in anthropology, which is inflicted, I think, on most junior people because no one wants to teach it after a while. I was then given kinship, not that I asked to want to do kinship, but I was given kinship because no one else wanted to do kinship. I was then assigned African political systems because that was in the catalog and had been taught by Tom Beidelman, who had left. And so I was following the Africanist Tom Beidelman, teaching African political systems. And I think I was expected, having been at Oxford, to know African political systems. So I had never really done those, the units on African systems at all at Oxford. And then finally, I was given religion. Now, that was the one that was the real trap, which I didn't know because there was a internal faculty dispute, and they were taking the course on religion from someone who had been teaching it for 20 years. And so he immediately thought I was responsible for that and I was his enemy. Well, we made it up in the end when I explained I had no desire to teach his religion course. But anyway, so that was the 4 courses. And I spent most of the year at Duke University, struggling to prepare my lectures, one day, 1 hour before they had to give them. And you're not, when you're just beginning, you have no finesse in how you time your lectures or how you present them. Everything is new and actually quite challenging. The one good thing, one of many good things at Duke University was that because I taught such a large course, I was able to call on all of the graduate students, and I got to know Rick Huntington, who was doing his PhD at Duke and wrote a marvelous thesis on the Bara, and we were very close. Bara is a fascinating society at the southern end of Madagascar. And then another Peter Huber, who worked in the Upper Sepik, and both Peter and Rick taught at Princeton, and then for a while Rick taught at Harvard. But they were both good anthropologists, and I'm still in touch occasionally with Peter Huber. All right. During my second semester at Duke, I had a call from Harvard, and they offered me a decent lectureship. I accepted on the spot, and I moved to Oxford. I moved to Harvard. At Harvard, the year I arrived, there had already been very substantial disruptions because of Vietnamese protests, and there were even more disruptions in that first year at Harvard. In fact, the second semester of courses were canceled without the last lectures. I was grateful to that. I was also, quite interestingly, assigned radical students, and I was made tutor to senior students at Harvard who were particularly or considered radical and were radical. I ended up with two students, a man and a woman, a boy and a girl, let's call them, they were young, who were in Spartacusbund, which was one of the more radical student groups on campus at Harvard and at MIT. And I got on well with them, very well with them, because I said at the very beginning, I said, you must know all of Marx. I couldn't possibly teach you Marx, so we'll study Weber, because it's so different, and you'll be able to criticize Weber from a Marxist point of view. We had some very good tutorials, and they were both very, very interesting students. One of them was a very large black, very smart, very, very able, but he would come from time to time, he would be wounded because Spartacusbund had internal fights and they were fighting with each other. But I think it's possible they even saved my life, because there was even one more radical group on the Harvard campus at that time called the Weathermen. And the Weathermen were responsible that year for killing a University of Chicago faculty member. And they knew, and they've gotten word, and they found out that one member of the Weathermen was tracking me. For what reason, I don't know. And they offered me protection. And given who they were, I was very confident they provided me protection. And I never worried about the radicalization of the radical students. So that was that. I was stuck teaching political systems, not African political systems. And I ended up with two graduate students who were at the opposite end of the spectrum. And in the course of my wanderings around the campus, I discovered that each of them was leading their tutorial group in protest marches against the other. So one of the students was from Turkey, and she was way on the right wing, and another was an American student, she was on the left. And my students, when they were supposed to be getting their tutorials, were actually being utilized for different protests. So that was the state of Harvard for that first year. One aspect of Harvard that was extremely important for me, very important to me, is that I met Roman Jakobson. I had been working on what I had called ritual language, which was in fact what Jakobson calls canonical parallelism. And he was really taken with the Rotani's work. He was really taken. So the first article I wrote on semantic parallelism in Rotani's ritual language was the first of the continuing influences from Roman Jakobson. Roman Jakobson was very accessible. I had many meetings with him. I had lunch with him and his wife, and I eventually, as you probably know from my publications, I wrote an article for his 85th anniversary festschrift, in which I looked at his writings on parallelism. And it turns out that even when he was in Moscow, he had begun writing his parallelism. Now, one of the interesting things about that is that Jakobson called parallelism as the double door to anthropology and linguistics. And he would talk about Levi-Strauss and Levi-Strauss's interest in binary categories and everything else. But for him, parallelism was this near universal, which demanded attention on a global scale. You had to compare it. And that is one of the directions of my research ever since, has been on the comparative study of parallelism. We'll talk more about that. It was also a time when I was writing other articles, and I wrote articles, one called Our Ancestors Spoke in Pairs, on binary categories and primary symbols. This was, let's say, it was an intense linguistic phase in my anthropological research. Another aspect of Harvard, which was extraordinary, and that was the number of students, the really brilliant students that I had. And again, I can only mention a few of them, but one of them was one that you would be well aware of, was the husband and wife team, Renato and Shelley Rizaldo, or Michelle Rizaldo. And Renato had been a classmate of mine at Harvard when I was an undergraduate. We knew each other. He was at the very end of his thesis, and I really didn't have much, but formally I was his supervisor. Shelley, on the other hand, Michelle was still in the early stages of her, and so I worked very closely with her on her thesis on the Ilongot. And I regard Shelley's study of the Ilongot, emotions among the Ilongot, as one of the real masterpieces of Philippine ethnography. It is an extraordinary piece of work. She was an outstanding student, and then tragically, she fell from a path in the mountains when she was studying the Ifugao. She fell to her death, and anthropology lost an extraordinary anthropologist. Another student of mine, Elizabeth Traub, was a student who had a strong Portuguese background. She had studied in Brazil. She was interested in folklore and other things, and I sent her to East Timor, Portuguese East Timor, where she did research among the Mambai of central East Timor, one of the largest groups in East Timor, and wrote another really extraordinary book. It's well worth reading. It was published by the University of Chicago Press, and another, I think, anthropological monument. Finally, I'd mention Arthur Kleinman. Arthur eventually became the head of the anthropology department at Harvard long after I had left. But Arthur, at this time, was still doing psychiatry and was interested in anthropology, and took my course, one of my courses, and we got to know each other very well. And he eventually went on, did his degree, got a PhD in anthropology, and really defined for American anthropology a wide range of psychiatric medical anthropology. So he made his contribution. Fine. The next thing I should mention is that each summer, for a succession of summers, while I was at Harvard, I would return to Europe. My wife would take our two boys to Germany, to Freiburg. And I would go to Leiden. Well, I would live in Leiden because I'm comfortable in Leiden. But I would go every day to The Hague to work on the Dutch archives. And these were the Dutch archives of the Dutch East India Company. The first task, which was daunting at the beginning, was just to try to read the scripts. And the scripts are challenging, but once you begin to do it, you can slowly make your way through it. The archives of the fail-say of the Dutch East India Company on Timor are enormous. They extend from 1652 on an annual basis, 1652 to about 1787 when they begin to peter out. And they document in great detail what was going on in Timor. It's extraordinary to have that historical glimpse at the society you studied in 1965, 66. You have this historical glimpse that goes back over 200 years. Now, as that's led to, for example, my writing of this article, Rothenese dynastic genealogy, because I was able to show, using the Dutch archives, that every single ruler in the long genealogy, certainly from, let's say, in the long genealogy from Roti, all the rulers named from 1653, 1654 were in place and in sequence. So that was not a fictitious genealogy. And one of the purposes of that article was simply to question that not all genealogies are fictitious, and some of them are in fact very useful. In the Rothenese context, the genealogy of the ruler is the skeleton, the very backbone of all the oral narratives. And you have to place the oral narratives in terms of a specific ruler. And then you understand the sequence. There is no dating sequence, but the sequence of the rulers establishes a chronological sequence, and it's understandable. So that was very important work. Then after a couple of years at Harvard, I had an invitation to go to the Institute of Advanced Study in Palo Alto in California. And there I was able to concentrate on trying to get all my work, I was able to translate all of my recorded texts. All of the ones I had, I was able to translate them. I was also able to write the first draft of the book, Harvest of the Pau, which became Harvest of the Pau. I had different names for it. And there was nothing I had ever experienced quite like the center, because they went to great extent to keep you from all distractions so you could concentrate on your work. So even to make a phone call or to receive a phone call was a task. And so you stopped communicating and you started concentrating on your work. One thing in retrospect, one of my best memories of that time, and of all the colleagues, I was there with many colleagues and very, very intelligent, wonderful colleagues, but the person who stands out in my memory to this day is Bruno Bettelheim. And Bruno Bettelheim, I got on very well with him. I enjoyed his company. We would have lunch as often as we could together in Palo Alto. We had dinners. He was an extraordinary contrarian. Before I got to know him, I just observed him, and I could see that in succession, he would take the opposite side from almost any position in order to provoke a discussion and a debate. And I recognized he didn't know it, but this was a Rothenese in disguise. This is the way we dealt with people on Roti. This is a Rothenese. He was himself a true Viennese intellectual, but he acted just like a Rotanese, and we got on wonderfully. Okay, the story ends, I suppose I could say this, all of that was preparation for my next field work on Roti. I returned to Roti for a year. The family lived in Kupang, and I went frequently to Roti for long periods. Old Menno had died, but some of those who had been with me and apprenticed to Menno poets were there, and they picked up where I left, and I went on doing the kind of field work that I had done in 65, 66, but just more of it. And this just meant that the amounts of material from my first and from the second field trip is so large that I still haven't fully dented all of the work I have. I returned after that time on Roti. I spent another year at Harvard and decided to move to Australia. So let's stop there, and we will resume things, I hope, with my discussion of what it was like coming to Canberra. All right. Well, you do it twice, three times. That's what happens in oral poetry. Okay, okay, good. Thank you. Now check, and then start again. Okay, good. I'll leave. My wife is very anxious to know what's going on, and I tell her I don't know.